Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 850 for December 20th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
It takes remarkable people to create remarkable brands, and John and Alexander and George and the second Alexander, John Blakey, James Stevenson, these men were just top-notch.
Dr. Nick Morgan is retiring after more than 30 years at Diageo. His final project was writing the definitive history of Johnnie Walker. His new book, A Long Stride, is part of the 200th anniversary celebration of John Walker opening his original grocery store in Kilmarnock, Scotland, blending whiskeys as well as teas. I'll talk with Nick Morgan later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and...
It is just getting down to the short strokes, and there's a lot of politics involved and a lot of pressure.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey, whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories, but for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So this holiday, give the gift of a good story and even better whiskey. Give the gift of Dewar's 15.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Happy holidays! On behalf of Redbreast, here's to you and yours. Eating well, enjoying a redbreast or two, and getting all snug and cozy on the couch. Reminds me of my own nest. Sure, there's no cushions or blankets, but I do have some very fancy decorative twigs, let me tell you.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. As I'm recording this on Sunday evening, there's word from Washington that congressional leaders have reached a tentative agreement on a $900 billion coronavirus economic relief package. That legislation is being lumped in with a budget agreement that not only covers federal spending through the rest of the fiscal year, but we're being told that it may also make the federal excise tax break that small-scale distillers are depending on permanent. While the leadership may have an agreement, you got to keep in mind, though, that no one has actually seen the text of the legislation yet, and the devil is in the details. On top of that, 535 members of the House and Senate are able to muck things up with last-minute objections. Distilled Spirits Council CEO Chris Swanger was one of the guests on Friday's Happy Hour webcast.
We've been living on pins and needles over the last couple of days, and it's part of the seems like the annual suspense of the dog days of December. But look, we're feeling fairly good about where we are.
Congress has already had to pass one short-term extension to keep federal agencies open through the weekend, and will likely have to pass another 24-hour extension to allow for the flurry of votes needed to pass everything. In addition to the federal excise tax break, distillers need the budget passed in order to keep the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau from shutting down its label approval system, while distillers, retailers, and the entire hospitality industry need financial help from the COVID relief package. Meanwhile, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said this week that there's a good chance the U.S. and Great Britain will be able to reach a new free trade agreement soon. He told the BBC that a final deal would have to wait until after the U.K. sorts out its differences with the European Union, but that an interim deal could be worked out that removes the U.S. tariffs on single malt Scotch whiskies and other U.K. exports. Last week, British Secretary of State Liz Truss said the UK would suspend its tariffs on U.S. exports stemming from the Airbus-Boeing subsidy dispute between the U.S. and Europe. Scotch Whisky Association leaders urged the two governments to keep working out their differences. It's now estimated that the current 25% U.S. tariff on single malt Scotch whiskies has cost the industry around $540 million in lost export sales. As for the Brexit negotiations, the coronavirus pandemic has thrown yet another wrench into those talks. England's emergency lockdown this weekend has led to many European countries banning travelers from the UK in the days leading up to Christmas. That includes Ireland, which is banning all non-essential travel from England for at least 48 hours, but there will be no restrictions on border travel between Ireland and Northern Ireland. On top of that, France is blocking all non-essential truck traffic from the UK via ferries and the Eurotunnel for at least 48 hours. While that will have a major impact on food shipments from Europe to the UK, it also means trucks hauling whiskey shipments to Europe will be delayed. Talks between British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government and EU leaders continued through the weekend. Bloomberg News reports both sides are hoping to have a deal in place by Christmas Day, with European access to British fishing areas seen as the one remaining hurdle. If there is no deal by New Year's Day, World Trade Organization policies would determine the trading relationship between the UK and its former partners in Europe. Now, how about some good news when it comes to governments and whiskey? Kentucky's new state law allowing distilleries to ship whiskeys directly to consumers took effect last Tuesday, and it works both ways. Distilleries outside of Kentucky will be allowed to ship their products directly to Kentucky consumers once they have a direct shipper's license from the Commonwealth. As of now, the law only allows shipping to and from Washington, D.C., and 9 states that have reciprocity agreements with Kentucky. Those states: Alaska, Arizona, Connecticut, Hawaii, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Dakota, and Rhode Island. One caveat: the law only allows distilleries to ship across state lines. Retailers are not covered by the new law. One more business story now. Moet Hennessy is joining forces with Whistle Pig Whiskey. Moet Hennessy will serve as Whistle Pig's primary exporter as the Vermont distillery tries to boost its global profile. In addition, the Paris-based company is buying a minority stake in Whistle Pig for an undisclosed amount. Moet Hennessy also owns the Glenmorangie Company, which owns the Glenmorangie and Ardbeg distilleries in Scotland, along with the Woodinville Whiskey Company in Washington. Now, let's get to the whiskey. Congratulations to the Mackenzie Smith family and their team at Lindoris Abbey Distillery in Scotland. Their first 20 casks turned 3 years old today. The first whiskey from those casks will be made available in early 2021 to members of the distillery's 1494 Society. You can listen to my August 2017 interview with Drew Mackenzie Smith in episode 654, and my April 29 conversation with distillery manager Gary Taggart in episode 762. They're both available in the archives at whiskycast.com. We also want to send along our congratulations to Jennifer Nickerson and Leah Mahern of Ireland's Tipperary Boutique Distillery. You may remember Jennifer and her father, longtime Scotch whiskey distiller Stuart Nickerson, joined us on our July 29th live webcast. At the time, she only needed the local revenue officer for the county, and there's only one for the entire county, to visit the distillery.
It's an absolute nightmare. Everything else is done. We need to do a little bit with the chiller, and obviously Stuart needs to come over and actually start the commissioning, but it's really pointless until we get revenue to prove that they're happy for us to go ahead. And I've been trying to get her to come out to me since the start of July, and we're now nearly in August. It's it's a nightmare.
Good news, the revenue officer finally showed up, the chiller is chilling, and Stuart made it over from Scotland to commission the stills. Tipperary Boutique Distillery opened for real the other day. with the capacity to fill 9 casks of new make spirit each week using the barley from Liam's family farm. Once again, congratulations. We'll be talking more about Johnnie Walker in a few minutes, but there is word of 2 new releases this week. The annual Zodiac series release of Johnnie Walker Blue Label is out. This year's version celebrates the Year of the Ox on the Chinese calendar. And Diageo is going to test market a new lighter version of Johnnie Walker. It's called Johnnie Blonde. It's made using wheat and fruity malt whiskeys and is intended to be mixed with lemonade, ginger ale, or colas. It'll be tested in several cities starting in March, including Houston, Monterrey, Mexico, Bangkok, Sofia, Bulgaria, and several German cities. The recommended retail price will be about $25 a bottle in the U.S. Hunter Lang & Company is kicking off a new series of Port Ellen releases. The Eidolon series takes its name from Greek literature, where Eidolon is said to be a recollection of something memorable. Stuart Lang and his sons picked that name as Diageo gets ready to resume production at Port Ellen sometime in 2021. The first release in that 3-part series is a 36-year-old Port Ellen distilled in 1983, just before the distillery closed. Only 683 bottles will be available. No word on pricing. Meanwhile, the other side of the Lang family, Douglas Lang & Company, is winding up 2020 with 2 new XOP Black single casks, a 45-year-old 1975 Teaninnick, and a 1989 Glenrothes. Once again, no word on pricing. Compass Box released its original Magic Cask bottling back in 2006. It was an exclusive bottling for Canada's Liquor Control Board of Ontario. Now, John Glazer and his team have revived the Magic Cask name for a new blended malt made from Speyside whiskies, including some stock from the old Imperial Distillery. It also includes some young whiskey Compass Box bought as new make spirit straight from an undisclosed distillery and moved it a year later into first fill Oloroso seasoned sherry butts. Magic Cask will sell in the UK for around £145 a bottle. It'll also be available in other markets as well. There is no word yet on U.S. pricing. In the U.S., Barrel Craft Spirits has released its final bottling of the year. Barrel Bourbon Batch 27 blends straight bourbons from Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana, ranging between 5 and 15 years old. It carries a recommended retail price of $90 a bottle. If you're in Scotland and someone offers you a good deal on some Glenfiddich 12-year-old, well, the police in Scotland would like to hear from you. That's because someone stole an entire truckload of Glenfiddich, 2,400 cases, back on December 11th from the Clydesmill Industrial Estate in Glasgow. The truck was found a few days later, 5 miles away, but the bright red trailer had been completely emptied out. And finally, we're a month away from the premiere of The Water of Life, a new documentary film on Scotch whiskey. Director Greg Swartz was one of our guests on the Friday Night Happy Hour webcast a couple of weeks ago. I caught up with him the other day for an update.
This first screening is going to begin on January 22nd. We're going to do it sort of tying in with Burns Night. It seemed appropriate. We were looking for a date. And then we're going to be doing it a number of times because we have an audience that's sort of spread around the world. We're going to do it a number of times a day, 4 or 5 days. That's part of that whole celebration.
Swartz and his team are working on offering tasting kits with whiskeys timed to specific scenes in the film. Details on those kits and tickets are available at wateroflifefilm.com. We have a link in our show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long. Hope you've enjoyed our live webcasts this year. The Friday Night Happy Hour webcast will be taking the next 2 weeks off for the holidays, but will return on January 8th with weekly live webcasts each Friday night at 5 p.m. New York time on the WhiskyCast YouTube channel, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Periscope. We will have a new episode of WhiskyCast this coming weekend during the holidays. I'll be talking with the team at Kentucky's Castle and Key Distillery, which has just released its first whiskey since the restored Old Taylor Distillery came back to life in 2017. And 2 weeks from now, I'll be announcing our next Whiskey Club of the Month winner on our first episode of 2021. There is still time to nominate your whiskey club. Just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. You could win 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at your club tastings. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events, brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. We do have one update from last week. We have now received word that Whiskey Live in Singapore, scheduled for the weekend of January 16th and 17th, has now been postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. The new dates will be announced in the coming weeks. Whiskey Land in Taipei, Taiwan, is hosting a charity whiskey tasting January 3rd. YourStories.com has The Best Night Out In. It's an online whiskey chat with Billy Abbott and Rachel McCormick on January 14th. And Spirit World in Omaha, Nebraska is hosting an online Women in Whiskey discussion in partnership with the Omaha Whiskey Fest on January 21st. The Spirit of Toronto Festival kicks off its Robert Burns Virtual Tastings Series on January 21st with 4 online tastings through the 24th. And Maker's Mark teams up with the Lee Initiative for the final community bottle event on January 25th at Teresa's in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Bonham's kicks off the 2021 auction calendar with an auction of whiskeys January 29th in Hong Kong. We're updating the calendar at whiskycast.com through the week as we get updates on event changes. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You ever wondered what veggies, salt, chili peppers, and even beans can do to a cocktail? Catoctin Creek co-founder Scott Harris is leading his 7th annual Art of the Cocktail class this winter. But this year, it's all online, Friday nights starting January 8th. Scott's looking at wacky and weird ingredients you may never have tried. And you can get all the details at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com. Catoctin Creek reminds you to always drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Mark, how are you, buddy? A quick thank you for letting me loose on WhiskyCast this past year. Oh, cheers for letting Dave tag along too. And happy holidays from all of us at Redbreast. We'll see you in Cork again soon, but until then, sláinte.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by the 2020 Distillers Edition collection.
Dr. Nick Morgan, the head of whiskey outreach at Diageo, joins me now, and he is the author of the new book, A Long Stride, which I think, Nick, has to be the definitive history now of Johnnie Walker in its 200 years.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's the definitive history until someone writes one that's better. And when they do, I will congratulate them very, very much, actually.
Well, somebody will have to write one 50 years from now for the 250th anniversary, but it won't be you or me.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I hear tell that you're planning to retire now after this.
Yeah, it was always my ambition to write this book, Mark, from a long time, almost from joining Diageo, which is more years ago than I care to recall. And when I was given the chance to write the book, which was all agreed about 3.5, 4 years ago, I made it very clear that once it was written, I would be saying goodbye to Diageo and with great thanks and gratitude. So I'll be moving on at the end of the year.
What are you going to be doing?
Well, I have another book project that's already sort of agreed, and I've got a couple of book ideas that I want to put to publishers, and a few people are talking to me about interesting different projects. So I'm certainly not going away. I'm not quite sure what I'll be doing when I'm not going away, you know.
How much of this book was connected to the research that went into the Johnnie Walker experience that's being built in Edinburgh right now that will open sometime next year?
Yeah, well, that's of course is something else that should have opened in the anniversary year, and of course because of circumstances wasn't able to. Well, the two sort of feed off each other a little bit. So the guys working on the Princes Street project have been talking to me, and I've been explaining some of the things perhaps that weren't known before that are in the book, and emphasizing, I think, some of the key themes which they'll then be exploring in their experience that they'll be offering to the visitors that come there.
We need to explain that this is the 200th anniversary in 2020 of John Walker, not necessarily creating the Johnnie Walker whiskey, but opening his grocery shop in Kilmarnock, right?
So the grocery shop was opened in 1820. John's father had died the previous year, a relatively young man, which was something that afflicted a few generations of the Walkers. He was a farmer in Ayrshire, a relatively prosperous farmer, and his cattle and seeds and all the chattels that went with the farm were sold off, and some of that money was invested in the grocery business. John was a miner when he went into it, so we have to assume that he actually would have probably been apprenticed, because there was a manager put in there at the same time. And the earliest insight we have into what was being sold in the shop, which is from about 1825, shows that it was a grocer's shop selling tea and spices, all of that sort of stuff, and selling whiskey, a lot of whiskey.
And that was his most valuable commodity, was the whiskey part, right?
Well, certainly by the time he retired, it was. When he died, when John died, which was 1857, he'd run the business for nearly 40 years. And when he died, it was a very prosperous grocery business in Kilmarnock. And there were a number of prosperous grocery businesses in Kilmarnock. And it specialized in blending whiskey. So that was his biggest item by value. The next, in fact, was tea still, which was very important. And also his will shows us that he had built up quite a large wholesale business, because he had a lot of business debtors who were sort of innkeepers and wine and spirit merchants all around Kilmarnock, who were obviously buying his blended whiskey and selling it to their customers.
Many of the grocers of that time, and you alluded to this, were blending teas. How did he go from blending tea to blending whiskey?
Well, grocers blended many things. I mean, the tea was the most important, but the idea of keeping a grocery shop was, as far as you could, to try and make things better one way or the other by maturing them or by blending them. And that also gave you the opportunity to sell something that was distinctly your product, as opposed to the product that the guy next door was selling. And John Walker did have grocers next door. I mean, on King Street in the middle of Kilmarnock, there were about 9 different grocers. So there's a lot of competition. And I think the link between tea blending and whiskey blending is simply that some of the principles of tea blending relate very closely to the principles of whiskey blending, that you group teas together of different sort of core flavors in the same way as blenders will group whiskies together, sort of Highland, Island, Lowland. And then you learn how to blend them together, blend one group of teas, another group of teas, and then finally bring them all together in one, which is more or less exactly the same as whiskey blenders were doing in the 19th century. So there are a lot of parallels. And I think there's also a lot of parallels in appreciating what your customers like, because preferences for tea in Scotland in the 19th century were very regional. And I think at the time, preferences for styles of whiskey were quite regional as well. So in Ayrshire, for example, where Kilmarnock was, people really liked Campbelltown whiskies. They were very, very popular in the mid-19th century. And we know from the inventories that we have that Campbelltown whiskies, of course, many from distilleries that are now long gone and long forgotten, made up one of the principal sources of whiskey in John's stocks, along with Islay whiskey and then grain whiskey, which he brought in from Glasgow.
So it's fair to say that John Walker was the Jim Beveridge of his day.
Oh, yes, very, very much. Very much. And he passed those skills on to his son, Alexander, who built up a huge business. So was a serious international businessman. But at the same time, from everything we know about Alexander, there was nothing he liked better than to get down with the whiskey and sort of sort out problems or try and create new blends.
And I know that some of the blends that are being created today by Jim and the current blending team actually derive from Alexander Walker's original blending notes, right?
Well, it's from the second Alexander. So we have the second Alexander's blending books, Mark, which are beautiful small little notebooks with his literally dashing down ideas for different blends. And I know that Jim Beveridge and his colleagues have had recourse to that on numerous occasions, looking for ideas and inspirations for new products.
When we talk about the history of blended Scotch whiskey, people seem to think that it starts with Andrew Usher and moves on, but Usher was a couple of decades behind John Walker and his contemporaries, right?
So I think there are two. Yeah, yes. Good point, Mark. There are a couple of things. I mean, the claim that's made for Usher, which is, as far as I can discover, without any substantiation whatsoever, so I don't quite understand where it came from. But the claim that's made for Usher is sort of first blender on a commercial scale. Okay. Now, the fact of the matter is that we know that whiskey blending, both the blending of single malt whiskies and also the blending of grain whiskies, albeit grain whiskies made in pot stills and single malts in Scotland, certainly went on from the very, very early 1800s, if not into the late 1780s, 1790s. And most of the shopkeepers, I imagine, in Kilmarnock, along with John, were blending their own whiskies of one sort or another. I mean, and we know he had a couple of very well-established competitors who were actually taken over by the Walker business in the course of time. So blending was going on all over Scotland way before Usher's even looked at it. Were Usher's first blenders on a commercial scale? Well, no, I don't think so. If I look at John Walker's business and the way it was in the 1860s, and other businesses that were around as well, I'm not claiming primacy for Walker's, but I just think there were so many other people doing it. It's difficult and, in a sense, futile to try and claim to be the first. You know, I mean, the thing about Walker's, they wouldn't bothered about being the first in this instance. They just wanted to be the best. You know, that was what drove them.
And with Usher, that term commercial scale is sort of like small batch. There's no real definition for commercial scale, right?
No, and I think one of the things that actually surprised me looking in detail at the Walker business was just to discover for them how big commercial scale meant by the 1870s and 1880s. I mean, in 1881, Alexander Walker claimed to have exported 50,000 12-bottle cases, which is an astonishing amount if you think of all the logistics and stuff that goes with that. And 10 years later, 1890, the company claimed to have exported 120,000 cases. And that's absolutely massive business, massive business. And with that goes a huge degree of innovation in the back room. I mean, how do you suddenly think that you're going from a grocer's shop to export? I mean, you're selling far more in the UK, in London and all around the country here. You're going to export 50,000, 100,000 12-bottle cases. I mean, it's really hard to grasp. And in fact, there's a brilliant quote from Alexander Walker from the early 1880s, where he says, he's writing to a friend in a letter, and he says something like, I'll paraphrase, "My business seems to double itself every year, and sometimes I wish it would undouble itself because it's more than one head can handle," And I think that gives a real indication into how astonishingly vigorous the growth of the business was at that point.
There are brands today that would kill just to have 50,000 cases sold in a year.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
Let alone exporting.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
How did the Walker family survive the whiskey bubble of 110, 120 years ago that was created by the Pattinsons?
Well, there were two whiskey bubbles, actually, Mark. There was one prior to the Pattersons, which is called the Kid Unson bubble. And then there's the Patterson bubble of 1899, or the Patterson crash. And the Walkers sort of managed their way out of both. Kid Unson was good for them because actually it put a lot of stock onto the market very cheaply. And one of the things that Walkers were really fixated on was having the largest stocks of whiskey. So in the same way that we've got 10 million or more casks today to choose from, they had, I don't know how many they said it was, but they had a ridiculously large inventory. When Patterson's crashed, Walker were immune from all of that because they had no financial association with any of the Patterson businesses or with any of the network of businesses that were established, connected with Patterson's, which was a very large network, and many people did suffer. So Walker were immune from all of that, but it did affect their business to the extent that in the early 1900s, the price of whiskey dropped a lot. And it meant that, relatively speaking, the whiskies that the Walkers were using for blending were far more expensive than their competitors. So actually, they had a bit of a dip, 1905, 1906, in profits because of the relative costs of business. But the real impact of Patterson's was not felt until after the First World War, really, in my opinion. Because the consolidation that happens in the business at that time, the loss of lots of blending companies and lots of broking companies, was all a hangover from what had happened at the end of the 19th century.
The family maintained control of John Walker and Sons until just before World War II in 1940.
Correct.
What happened after that? Explain the history of how Johnnie Walker went from being family-owned to now becoming the flagship for the world's largest whiskey company in Diageo.
Sure. So actually it predates 1940 because in 1924-25, Walker's, and again, this is part of this Patterson impact in my opinion, Walker's merged with John Dewar and Sons, James Buchanan, and the Distillers Company. And the Distillers Company were the largest producers of grain whiskey in Scotland and also by that time in Ireland as well, where they had very large distilling interests. So they formed what was called a combine. Within that, each company more or less managed itself as they had done prior to the merger, much to the irritation of the Distillers Company, who hadn't quite seen it working out like that. But certainly for Walkers, who had really strong personalities, Sir Alexander Walker by then, a man called James Stevenson, a young man who went on to be very famous called Ronnie Cumming. These people were very Walker focused and they had a very loud voice and they made sure they could run the business as they wanted to.
And you mentioned Ronnie Cumming. His mother was Elizabeth Cumming, if I remember correctly, who we don't give a lot of credit to, but she owned Cardew Distillery, which became the first distillery that the Walker family purchased, right?
The second. They had one in Annan just before that. I think Ronnie was her grandson, Mark, not her son, her grandson. Ronnie Cox is related to Ronnie Cummings as well, and you'll know Ronnie Cox very well. So they went into the combine in 1924, managed the company very independently. Sir Alexander Walker there, a very, very strong voice. He retires in 1940, but there's still a very strong sense of Walkerness in the Walker business. All the people that are in there have been there, so no one ever left. You know, people joined the Walker company and almost without exception never left. So even going into the post-war years, there's a very strong sense of what Walker is about, both back in Kilmarnock still, which is where the whiskey is being blended and bottled, and in their London offices. And it's in the post-Second World War period that the Johnnie Walker brand becomes by far and away the largest within the Distillers Company portfolio. And a lot of that is due to their business in the United States with Johnnie Walker Black Label.
And eventually, through a series of mergers and acquisitions, Distillers Company becomes United Distillers, becomes part of Grand Met, becomes tied up with Guinness, and becomes Diageo.
More or less in that, not quite in that order, but that's you more or less got it. So, and it's 1997 when Diageo is formed. Yeah.
And back in 1997, if I remember correctly, were you still in Louisville back then?
No, I was in Scotland. I'd spent a lot of time in the 90s in Louisville. A lot of time. In fact, I was reflecting on that, talking to someone only a couple of weeks ago, and I think the last time I was there was about 3 years ago, and I have to say I miss it very much. I know it changed a lot. I was quite surprised when I was last there, although changed for the better. I think a much more vibrant place than it had been. But I was always very fond of it and very fond of Kentucky. And some of the whiskies as well, I have to say.
And you were doing a lot of historical work and outreach work at that time. I know you were working with Mike Veach to catalog all the archives.
Well, we tried to get that archive together from material that had been stored by Shenley Company up in New York, or just on the outskirts of New York, where I spent quite a lot of time. And we eventually sort of cherry-picked that and got material sent down to down to Louisville. There'd been material in Texas as well, in Dallas. It was all very complicated how this stuff was spread around the States, but we got it all into Stitzel Weller in the end. And Chris Morris was there, who was working with us, and Mike Veach worked for Chris and was there cataloging all the stuff, or as much as he could.
What's going to become of that someday? Because I know it's still in storage in Louisville. If I remember correctly, I believe there's a cavern somewhere.
I'm not entirely sure, Mark. I know some of it, I think, went to the University of Kentucky, I think. So some got into a professional repository and some is still in the hands of Diageo and has been used, I know, for the work they've done for the Stitzel Weller Visitor Center, and I think also for some of the things they're doing at Bullet.
What did you learn in researching this book that you didn't know before about the Johnnie Walker brand and the Walker family?
Well, few things. I think the first I would say is that even though I'd looked at some of this material before, and obviously had spent quite a lot of time thinking about it as well, I hadn't really realized what a remarkable group of people the Walkers and the largely men that helped them in business were. I mean, it takes remarkable people to create remarkable brands. And John and Alexander and George and the second Alexander, John Blakey, James Stevenson, these men were just top notch. And it was very interesting, I thought, that Alexander surrounded himself eventually with, particularly when he went down or sent the business down to London in the 1870s, which was a critical sort of step in their growth. He didn't have the best experience down there, so eventually he just sent people from Kilmarnock down to London to manage the business, because who else could you trust? It's got to be people from Kilmarnock. But they were remarkable. And I think one of the things that sets them out, I think, is their resilience. And it's interesting that, in a sense, this has become a message for the modern times that we're in now. But one of the things I did for the book was try and get into the ledgers and the accounts to get a financial picture of how the business grew and how profitable it was, where it sold whiskey and stuff like that. And really, in one sense, depending on what you're interested in, there are about 5 or 6 graphs in that book, and you only need to look at the graphs. You don't need to read the book. You could just look at the graphs, and they tell the story. And they tell a remarkable story about resilience, from the 1890s, the Patterson crash, which you've talked about, the Lloyd George budget of 1909, which everyone thought was going to bring the industry to its knees, the First World War, Prohibition, the Great Depression, the Second World War, the recovery from the Second World War, which took 10 years or more to even get off the ground. Whiskey is a long-term game. If you don't make whiskey for years, it takes you a long time before you can start selling it again. The incredible growth in the 60s and 70s, and then the oil crisis, then the next oil crisis, then the recession that followed that, and most recently the recession 2007, 2008. So the graph of business, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, but it keeps on going up, and every time it goes up more. And that's what you'll see from those graphs. And that really represents the resilience of something very special. It's not many brands that can do that. And it's deep in, I think, the whole psyche of the brand. It's a remarkable thing to see. And I think no one wants to be complacent in these times, but I think it should make people feel relatively confident about what's going to happen in the future as well.
Of course, the old saying is that those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. What mistakes were made over the 200-year period that we need to keep in mind in future generations? What lessons can we learn from the mistakes that were made? Because they had to have made some.
Yeah, well, actually, Walkers didn't make too many. And I suppose the big mistake, if you will, was less of a Walker mistake and more of a Distillers Company mistake in the 1970s when they withdrew Johnnie Walker Red Label from the UK market when it was selling between 1 million and 1.5 million cases because of a dispute with the European community. And that was ultimately harmful to the brand. It happened just at the wrong time because it was just when the oil crisis was hitting and the brand didn't really recover from that in the UK. And also from a competitor point of view, as a number of people who work for other whiskey companies pointed out to me, it opened the door, not just for brands like Famous Grouse and Bell's, blended scotches to come in to the UK, but also for those single malt whiskies, which were just starting really, and it started in the 1960s, but suddenly to have all of this open space in the UK market to try and get your brands established was a huge opportunity for the likes of Glenfiddich and Glenmorangie. So that wasn't the best thing they ever did, for sure.
But in some ways, it did pave the way for the Diageo single malts, the Lagavulins, the Obens, the Taliskers of the world, to develop the market share that they might not otherwise have gotten.
Indeed, although it could be said that the Distillers Company didn't see that opportunity. And it was only when United Distillers was formed that the classic malts were put out on the market and stuff like that. But it certainly helped in that respect, of course.
One final question. I won't ask you what your favorite Johnnie Walker expression is, but what is the oldest one that you've been able to taste in the bottle? Because I know that there's an archive with a bunch of them, and I see you reaching for something. So what's the oldest blend of Johnnie Walker that you've been able to get your hands on?
No, I can't just put my hands on it, and I certainly haven't tasted any of the ones in the archive because they're just never opened. But we did, along with some friends, about 2 or 3 years ago, we managed to get together a really nice flight of Walkers, and the earliest we had was from the late 1920s, early 1930s, and we went all the way through to the 1970s, 1980s. And that was all Johnnie Walker Red Label. And it was really, really interesting because the earlier one was, as you would expect, was smokier than today's because all whiskies have got lighter over that period, whether they're blends or single malts. That's following consumer taste. But it was still distinctly Red Label. There was something about it that made it Red Label. And the one that everyone really liked, which was quite surprising, I think, was the 1970s. Which I think when we did a sort of score around the table, everyone went for that one as being probably the nicest of the, I think we had 6 or 7 that we tasted.
Well, I guess I lied because this brings up another question. Obviously, the blends do change over time because the whiskeys changed over time as distilleries in the post-World War II era switched from using peat almost exclusively to being able to use natural gas for their malting, and became more of a commercial malting industry as opposed to each distillery having its own maltings. So how did that change the character of the whiskeys over the years?
Well, there's a lot more to it than that, Mark, although that obviously is really important. And it's one of the stories I try and tell in the book, because there's a progression of change from the mid-19th century up possibly to 30 years ago or something like that. Maybe it's still changing. And that change was driven as much by consumer taste and the way that whiskies were being drunk as anything else. So in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, a lot of blended Scotch whiskies were drunk in toddies, hot toddies. So hot water, sugar, lemon if you were lucky, and whiskey mixed together. Toddy whiskies were very heavy, peaty, oily is one of the descriptions of them, oily. And when people started drinking whiskey and soda, which was the big trend that really helped blended Scotch take off here, and the equivalent in the United States was people drinking what they called highballs in the late 19th, early 20th century, you needed a lighter style of whiskey for that. You couldn't use a toddy whiskey for whiskey and soda. It just wasn't going to happen, wouldn't be palatable. And it's interesting, if you look at the photographs of the Walker blending room, and there's one in the book, a really nice one from the 1890s. In the blending room, there are soda water bottles, right? So as now, the blenders were thinking about how their blends were going to be drunk. It wasn't just that you put something out there because you think it's good. It's what a consumer's looking for. And that change in the style that consumers wanted meant that distillers were actually changing what they were doing in the 1890s and early 1900s to produce whiskies that were lighter. And that trend in consumer taste towards slightly lighter whiskies all the time has carried on. And the change that you described in floor maltings, direct fired stills, were all possibly part of that. But it's a much longer continuum and journey driven by what consumers are looking for.
Well, I want to close this out with just a personal note here, since you are retiring from Diageo, because I owe you a lot of credit, Nick, because you have been instrumental in helping me learn more and more about whiskey. The first time we met was at Royal Lochnagar, I think, in 2009, when you and your colleagues invited me over for the malt whiskey class at Royal Lochnagar, which was sort of my first deep dive into the nuts and bolts of making Scotch whiskey and how it matures and everything. And I've sort of been able to build on that from there. But that provided the base for me to really learn what I was writing about and talking about. And I owe you that thanks for your contributions over the years, because I wouldn't be where I am today without your contributions. And I appreciate you very much, Nick.
Well, that's very kind, Mark. And I think the industry would say we appreciate what you've done very much as well. So we can thank each other in that respect.
Dr. Nick Morgan also appears in the new documentary film about Johnnie Walker. The Man Who Walked Around the World is now available to stream online at themanwho.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by the 2020 Distillers Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts range. Look for this year's editions of Oban, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. You can get the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I mentioned Whistle Pig's deal with Moet Hennessy during the news. Finally got the chance to taste the Whistle Pig Old World Rye. It's a 12-year-old whiskey distilled in Canada and matured for those 12 years in American oak, then finished in a combination of Madeira, Sauterne, and port wine casks. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has touches of fresh fruits, baking spices, hints of leather and tobacco, and a touch of brown sugar. The taste has notes of cherry cola, clove, cinnamon, and a hint of ginger, balanced by tree fruits, caramel, and brown sugar underneath. The finish is long and fruity with hints of cherries, peaches, apples, and lingering spices. I'm scoring the Whistle Pig 12 Old World Rye a 92. Crown Royal's latest Noble Collection release is a 16-year-old Canadian rye whiskey, bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has notes of toasted caramel, baking spices, touches of raisins, plums, and red grapes, along with hints of honey and incense. The taste has a good complexity, with baking spices balanced by a fruity tartness and touches of caramel, honey, raisins, and chocolate-covered cherries. The finish is long and slightly tart, with a hint of black cherries and lingering spices. I'm scoring the Crown Royal Noble Collection 16-year-old rye a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Friday the 13th may be thought of by many as unlucky. That's why Sagamore Spirit celebrates Rye Day the 13th instead. Sagamore Spirit is offering you the chance to win your own barrel of whiskey, sort of. Find out more at sagamorespirit.com/Rye Day the 13th. The contest ends next Thursday, December 31st, so you want to enter now. U.S. residents only, and Sagamore Spirit reminds you to always drink responsibly. Frey Ranch Distillers in Fallon, Nevada, may have made the biggest splash among newcomers to the U.S. whiskey world this year. Earlier in the year, Colby and Ashley Frey released first-rate bourbon and rye whiskeys. They've now followed up on that with their single-barrel Distillers Reserve bourbon. It's bottled at 63.19% ABV. The nose is sweet and dry with touches of sawdust and charred oak, caramel, honey, and muted spices. The taste is thick, chewy, and very spicy, with notes of chili powder and cinnamon bark, balanced by black tea with honey, a hint of apples, and charred oak. The finish, long and spicy with a nice underlying sweetness. I'm scoring the Frey Ranch Single Barrel Distillers Reserve Bourbon a 94. France has been one of the leading export markets for Scotch whiskies for many years now, but French distillers are making some excellent whiskies of their own. The Giraud family has been involved in the cognac industry for generations and is now producing Alfred Giraud French malt whiskey. I had the chance to try their Harmony malt this week. It's a blend of 3 non-peated malt whiskeys from different distilleries, along with a lightly peated malt, then finished in cognac casks. Harmony is bottled at 46.1% ABV, and the nose has just a touch of smoke, along with baked fruits, figs, and hints of Christmas cake, sandalwood, and cedar. The taste is thick, rich, and complex, with a fruity sweetness at first, followed by a burst of baking spices and a kiss of smoke. The finish is very long as that burst of spices fades away slowly. I'm scoring the Alfred Giraud Harmony French malt whiskey a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,000 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Dewar's guy. The holidays have always been a big part of our story. People have been unwrapping bottles of Dewar's for over 174 years. Once, we even had someone call our distillery requesting an entire cask for the holidays. That's right, a barrel full of delicious whiskey. If you were at that party, congratulations. It turns out wishes really do come true. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie McLeod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It makes for the perfect gift. A great introduction to Scotch for beginners and more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So whether you're buying a gift for your father-in-law or treating yourself, make it a Dewar's 15-year and share a few stories of your own. That's what the holidays and good whiskey are all about.
I just wanted to take a minute to wish you the happiest of holidays from our entire family. 2020 has been a year we will never forget, though I think we'd all like to. Here's hoping you and your family are able to make the most of the holidays safely and in good health, and that 2021 is a better year for all of us. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. The controversy that erupted the other day over a Wall Street Journal opinion column questioning incoming U.S. First Lady Jill Biden's use of doctor led to some discussion on our Twitter timeline. Dr. Biden has a Ph.D. in education and clearly has earned the right to be addressed as Dr. Biden. No arguments there. However, it does bring up the question of how we use the title of doctor here on WhiskyCast. With a couple of exceptions, I've tried to follow the U.S. media's standard style as defined by the Associated Press Style Book. AP style traditionally calls for using doctor before the name of a person who holds a degree of, in alphabetical order here, Doctor of Dental Surgery, Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Optometry, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine, Doctor of Podiatric Medicine, or Doctor of Veterinary Medicine. The reason? Most people associate the title of doctor with physicians. And the style book recommends that if the title is used, then there should be a line explaining the person's specialty, such as Dr. Jill Biden, who holds a doctorate in education from the University of Delaware. Here's an example. Stephen Hawking was one of the world's most brilliant scientists and earned his Ph.D. from Cambridge in applied mathematics and theoretical physics. When he died in 2018, the AP's obituary did not identify him as Dr. Hawking. Enough inside baseball. You see, though, since we have had a number of people with doctoral degrees outside of the medical field appear on WhiskyCast over the years, I decided it was time to settle this question once and for all with a Twitter poll. 82% of those responding said to give the PhDs their credit and introduce them as doctor, while 18% said to limit it to medical doctors. We had a lot of comments along the lines of this tweet from Phil Thomas at BGPhilT in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I have a daughter and son-in-law who graduated with an MD. It takes the same amount of time as another person who gets a master's and a doctorate. A PhD is a doctor of philosophy, while an MD is a medical doctor. No difference in the level of education, so call them all doctors. At Whiskey Canuck chimed in with this from Canada. Ask the person in question. I know a number of people with PhDs, and it's a mix if they want to be called doctor or not. Who needs the hassle of having someone hear doctor and try to diagnose a rash with a winking emoji? The best comment, though, came from someone who would be directly impacted by our final decision. Our pal Dr. Don Livermore of the Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, Ontario. Don holds a Ph.D. in brewing and distilling from Heriot-Watt University in Scotland. Here's what he tweeted. If this poll goes in the wrong direction, I'll have to change my Twitter handle, with a laughing emoji. His handle, @CDNWhiskeyDoc. So here's how we're going to handle it going forward. Since we rarely have medical doctors as guests on the show, I don't think we're going to confuse many people. So if someone holds a doctoral degree that's directly related to their role in the whiskey industry, and they want to be introduced as doctor, then we'll do it that way. For instance, Don Livermore's degree in brewing and distilling certainly applies, as would Dr. Bill Lumsden's degree in microbial physiology and fermentation science from Heriot-Watt. Dr. Nick Morgan's degree is in history, But since that directly applies to his role as a whiskey historian, it applies. Here's an example of where it wouldn't. Our friend Sam Simmons of Adam Brands holds a Ph.D. in English literature from the University of Edinburgh, and he started out blogging as, quote, Dr. Whiskey. With much respect for the hard work that went into earning it, unless he starts working on the links between Shakespeare and whiskey, sorry, Sam. Oh, one other thing. AP style does not call for those with honorary doctorates to be introduced as Dr. So-and-so. Thanks to everyone who responded to the poll. If you have a question, suggestion, gripe, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Here's a question for you. Which country has more whiskey distilleries, Ireland or France? The answer might just surprise you. Philippe Giraud of Alfred Giraud French Malt Whiskey was one of my guests on the Happy Hour webcast Friday night.
The business is booming. The French whiskey category remains small. There is a risk that production is actually going ahead of consumption. It's a small category, but it's growing very fast, and there is a lot of enthusiasm for French whiskey in the country right now.
At last count, Ireland has 38 whiskey distilleries, either in production, under construction, or in the planning process. That's according to Drinks Ireland and the Irish Whiskey Association. France has more than double that number. According to the Fédération du Whisky de France, there are about 90 whiskey distilleries in France, split into 4 categories. Those that are actively selling their own mature whiskey, such as Domaine des Hautes Glaces in the French Alps, and Distillery Veringhem in Bretagne, which sells its whiskies under the Armoric label. Then there are those, such as the Giraud family's own Saint-Palais distillery in Cognac, that are distilling whiskey, but their inventories are not yet 3 years old, along with distilleries that are under construction, and then those at various stages in the planning process. The Federation also counts 2 distilleries in French-controlled territories. P&M Whiskies is a partnership between the Pietra Brewery and Domaine Mavella on the island of Corsica, and the distillery L'Après Potier, which released its first England's Forest bourbon-style whiskey from Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean this year. The name comes from the original name English explorers gave to the island in the 1600s, England's Forest. The French eventually claimed the island and renamed it Bourbon Island. That lasted until 1794, when the island took its current name. And by the way, there was whiskey on Réunion Island long before Georges-Guillaume L'Après Potier started making whiskey. The legendary Paris whiskey shop La Maison du Whisky has a store on the island and even staged a whiskey live there several years ago. If there's something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a rare style of Irish whiskey with a creative twist. A unique triple-distilled blend of single pot still and single malt premium Irish whiskies. Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Do you dare to be creative?
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. My email address, comments at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Happy holidays! On behalf of Redbreast, here's to you and yours. Eating well, enjoying a redbreast or two, and getting all snug and cosy on the couch. Reminds me of my own nest. Sure, there's no cushions or blankets, but I do have some very fancy decorative twigs, let me tell you.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
At Doers, we love a good story. And that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Double series. 21, 27, and 32-year-old whiskeys, each double-aged for ultimate smoothness, then finished in different sherry casks, making them perfect gifts. Or even better, buy one and give it as a gift and keep the other for yourself. You know what they say, it's better to give and receive.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening. Please stay safe and enjoy the holidays.